So we're maybe ending this on a down note, as the title of the session indicates. But I think it is also really thinking. I think this panel is really thinking about what it means to be doing gender, sexuality, and women's studies at this particular moment. I'll go ahead again and introduce all of our speakers briefly, and then we'll be going in alphabetical order. I realize the slide is not in alphabetical order, so we'll be going in the order of the real Roman alphabet. Which means that our first speaker will be Gwendolyn Beetham, who is the Associate Director of GSWS here at Penn. Gwendolyn has been a fellow of the Democratizing Knowledge Project and the Institute for Research on Women, and is a former member of the Governing Council of NWSA. In 2022, Gwendolyn was awarded Penn's Model of Excellence Award in recognition of work on trans-affirming policies and care work advocacy. And again, as I've been saying, it's Gwendolyn and our associate director, our program coordinator, Riley Fortier, who have really pulled this program together. So I want us to just think a minute. Our second speaker will be Kathy Brown, who is David Boyes Professor of History here at Penn. Brown writes and teaches about the history of gender, sexuality, race, slavery, and the body. And Brown served as director of GSWS and FQT from 2017 to 2020. And I'll also add that she was one of the originators of Penn's Slavery Project, which has so importantly restored the history of our university's involvement with the slave trade. Our third speaker is not Jonathan Katz, but Nancy Hirschmann. And Nancy is Geraldine R. Segal Professor in American Social Thought and Professor of Political Science and GSWS at Penn. She was the director of GSWS from 2013 to 2016 and is really responsible for implementing a lot of the curricular and governing structures that have, brought us to the place that we are now. She also initiated an effort to get better space for GSWS and FQT, which resulted in our move to our current location in Fisher Bennett. Nancy has written articles and books on the concept of freedom through the greater lens of gender and class, and is more recently working in the areas of disability and gender. Our fourth speaker is Jonathan Katz, who is an art historian, curator, and queer activist. He is Associate Professor of Practice in Art History and GSWS and was Director of GSWS from 2020 to 2021. A challenging time to be directing, as we all know. Professor Katz is a pioneering figure in the development of queer art history, author of numerous books and articles, and curator of many exhibitions internationally and nationally, including the first major museum queer exhibition in the U.S., Hide/Seek, Difference and Desire in American Portraiture at the Smithsonian National Portrait Gallery. So we will turn to everyone's remarks, and we'll just go again in alphabet. Why am I leaving someone out every time? I don't...
I don't have a job yet, apparently.
No. I'm so sorry, Jessa. I honestly, I hope that
great companies.
No one, I think just a little out of my mind after this year and this semester and the past couple of days. So I'm so sorry. Jessa Lingel is an associate professor at the Annenberg School for Communication and core faculty in the GSWS program here at Penn. She also is the incoming director as of July 2024 of GSWS and of FQT. So Jessa will be taking us in, I'm sure, exciting and really important new directions over the next 3 years. Jessa's research interests include digital inequalities and technological distributions of power. Her activist work is centered around libraries and information, support for incarcerated folks, and addressing gaps in access to mental health care in Philadelphia. So I will now take a seat and we'll begin.
Okay. It's really nice to be here today on the last session of the symposium. Thank you all for coming and for all of your support over the past days and months of the planning of this symposium. It's been such a pleasure to see it all happening. My remarks today I have titled "On Bureaucratic Impossibilities and Being a Problem." 5 years ago, I organized and chaired a session at the National Women's Studies Association conference titled "The Bureaucratic Impossibilities of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies." This is a play on Wendy Brown's now classic 1997 essay that some of you may know, "The Impossibility of Women's Studies," in which Brown describes the epistemic challenges of building an academic field around a subject that is inherently and intentionally contingent, interconnected, and constantly shifting. Beyond the more theoretical questions of field formation and sustainability, most immediately in my role, I had been frustrated with the new course management system that was being rolled out at Penn. At the time, I joined together with similar programs around the university, urban studies, Asian American studies, laws, to share our fears about the challenges posed by the highly formulaic new system to our very interdisciplinary, very unformulaic programs. The course management system went forward as planned, resulting in untold hours of frustration and increased workloads for everyone who has had the pleasure of working with this system, and many of you here have. It posed so many challenges, in fact, that this year the Faculty Senate organized a subcommittee to look into the problems of the system. I think Kathy was on the subcommittee. The same concerns were raised that I and my interdisciplinary colleagues had shared during the development phase. I share this anecdote not only so that you can share my sense of frustration, though I hope you do, but because most of us in this room know what it takes to do that. To go into high-level administrative meetings, to plead your case only to be told no, to send email after email only to receive silence, or maybe an answer on the 5th or 10th or 15th try. To do that not just for 5 years, but for 5 decades, for 50 years. Becoming part of the university is to remain, as Sarah Ahmed would say, a problem. We are a problem because we recognize that what some may view as mundane inefficiencies are in fact intentional and inherent to the very structure of the university. That is, these seemingly trivial problems, when seen as a whole, are, again, as Sarah Ahmed puts it, not just about the failure of things to work properly, but can be how things are working, not just about an error in operating systems. Errors can be the operating system. So, what is to be done but to call these problems out and continue to do so? Because as gender scholars, we know that these problems are more than the extra hours spent on curriculum manager and the inconvenience of manually adding courses to this major or that minor's worksheet, rather than having them automatically populate the way that they do in economics. We know that these bureaucratic impossibilities have very real effects on the people that inhabit the university. For as our colleague Beans Veloci reminds us, doing this work is not just about finding an intellectual home, it also requires having a body in space. We know that the same systems that attempt to discipline our curriculum into their structures also attempt to discipline bodies. They do this through the limited number of pronoun options in Canvas. They do this through the way one must enter and re-enter any name changes in 17 different systems. Okay, I may be slightly exaggerating, but not by much. Instead of having the systems speak to one another. They do this through requiring extra hoops for trans people to jump through to receive comprehensive health care. And yes, they do this by limiting access to bathrooms. I often joke with colleagues that my job is to constantly respond to gender emergencies or put out gender fires at the university. But in fact, it does remain an absolute honor to get to develop queer and trans curriculum and trans-affirming policies, and to work towards creating and maintaining a space for all genders to thrive at this university. It was GSWS that provided the funding to create the first trans studies course offered at Penn. It was GSWS and FQT that gave resources to the Trans Literacy Project. It is FQT that's working on a pioneering trans oral history project in partnership with community organizations. It is our grad students, faculty, and staff who continue to go above and beyond to fill the gaps in mentorship for queer and trans students from around the university, which is especially crucial in a political moment that is rife with anti-trans backlash and misogyny, and at a moment where gender studies and higher education itself is under attack. It was GSWS that funded students to help develop a course on sexual violence at the university, a course now in its second year that shows that although we've made huge progress since 1973, we still have a very long way to go. When I think back on all the things that GSWS FQT has been able to make happen to address these material concerns, only in the past 5 years, actually 7, that I've been at Penn, I see a direct line to those students, faculty, and staff 50 years ago, sitting on the floor at College Hall, and becoming such a problem that they forced the university to make profound changes to the way that gender is understood at this university. So here's to another 50 years.
Thanks, Gwendolyn. I'm just going to repeat the thanks to the conference organizers. And excuse me, I'm got a little frog in my throat. To Gwendolyn and to Riley and to Melissa Sanchez, but also the people who've been staffing the table and the people who are providing us with the technology that's making this happen. And to all of you for being here. I guess it's the bottom of the 9th inning and 2 batters have already struck out. And so we've got the former directors up here. Okay, so I thought about this for a long time and couldn't really figure out what I wanted to say until this morning at about 10:15 in a burst of desperate energy. So first I want to say that my peak joyful experience in my work life at Penn was working with Shauna Bahamut, Maria Murphy, and Gwendolyn Beetham. And I actually told myself, I'm angry, I'm not sad, but now I'm actually getting a little choked up. I felt like more part of a team doing meaningful work than I've ever felt in my entire career at Penn, and I'm heading on 30 years. I want to say, I think, as I look at my scattered notes here, I've got 4 main things to say, and I am really, really, really angry, okay? But I'm going to be very calm. I'm going to channel calm. So point number 1. The title of this session made me want to bring this caution to our discussion today, not to let the dire national situation lead us to forget the transnational, to be aware of and to incorporate global context, political struggles, and hard-won knowledge by scholars and activists across the world, many of whose struggles anticipate these we are currently facing in the United States. GSWS is weaker if it defaults to one of its interdisciplinary forebears, American Studies. We are stronger if we continue to think about our connections to people asking the same questions and fighting the same fights all around the world. So that's just a caution. But let's not be fooled. This is a pretty serious historical moment. I would put it up there with the Dred Scott decision in 1857. Maybe the Comstock Act of 1873. Or we could think about immigration quotas in 1924, or the year before the Voting Rights Act was passed. I think all of those moments sort of conjure up the sense of the ground beneath our feet shifting in ways that make our precarity feel deadly. There's only one upside for me as a historian. I no longer have a hard time convincing students that history isn't an automatic linear conveyor belt toward progress, a liberal vision of progress with expanded rights and autonomy and self-determination. I used to have to convince them that it wasn't just automatically moving like a conveyor belt up until about, I don't know. I wouldn't want to put a date on it, but I think up until Obergefell, it was hard to break people of the notion that it was just ticking along the way it was supposed to be, almost effortlessly, automatically. And I don't have that problem anymore. That's meant to be a very bitter, ironic upside, by the way. My third point is really a kind of a pep talk and about taking heart from the fact that GSWS is an interdisciplinary endeavor born of dissonance and struggle. We've always been banging our heads against the wall. We haven't known anything else. Did anybody ever think we were not going to be banging our heads against the wall? I just figured that's normal. And if I stop, I'm going to know it's really hurting. So better just keep doing it. It's a critical knowledge formation that subjects unscrutinized nodes of power that are cloaked in the mantle of the divine and of nature around women and their bodies, gender, sexuality, the gender binary, white supremacy, heteronormativity, cisness, the science of sex difference, ableism, and colonialism in all its many guises. Although the object of our inquiry may shift across these 50 years, the mode of inquiry, the questions we ask, the effort to unpack and dismantle and defang power, especially power that claims the natural and the divine, that is actually a through line. We're involved in the same project we've always been in, even if we now are talking about what is happening to trans people in this country right now. And maybe in 1973, we were talking about women, and sadly, the default for many of the white women involved was they were thinking only about themselves, about white women. At its heart, GSWS questions practices and patterns where power has derived from the false and ominous rationales and presumptions of the natural. Okay, my last point. Let's not forget in our attention to the dire national political moment that we remain weakly supported, even unsupported, by this university at a time when higher ed itself is under threat. We've made gains, but at the cost, for many of us I know on this panel and for the panel that came before us and everybody else who's probably in this room, at the cost of sleepless nights, endless trips to the dean's office, and our own personal research budgets, at times stressful confrontations with people we believe should know better and shouldn't have to be convinced to be our allies. So here we are, back in what seems like the beginning of the struggle. This is familiar territory. We know this. We know how to do this. We know how to fight this fight. We know how to keep showing up with friends and allies and hold on to our devastating analysis of power. If it weren't so devastating, we would not be in the, excuse my French, complete shitstorm that we are in right now. That's all I have to say.
That, as usual, you've said everything I wanted to say, but much more eloquently than I possibly could. Part of me thinks that, in a time of these, it's like, it's no different, right? We've had to fight, as Gwendolyn and Kathy have both said, all along. There was this moment, I think, it's too bad Carol Smith Rosenberg couldn't make it, because I think there was this moment at the creation of the Alice Paul Center where it was really easy. Demi, you can confirm that, I think, that there was going to be a deadline for, they were going to stop creating centers that didn't come with funding. And so Carol said, let's do it. Let's just create it. And it wasn't a vision. They didn't really have anything going on, but there was a center. So it seems like there may have been moments where it was a little easier, but it does seem like it's a 50-year history of fighting, as we've heard in the previous panel, as well as from my two co-panelists. And so, but just to reassure Phyllis, we're never going to be complacent. And you're right, we have achieved a lot. There's a lot of difference, a lot of things that we've gotten over the past 50 years. Never as much as we want, right? But we've gotten a lot of things, and we're vastly improved. Certainly, when you take into account, inflation, which is my version of sort of saying compared to Princeton, compared to Yale, compared to Harvard, compared to Columbia. I mean, these are not exactly feminist institutions, but they treat their gender studies programs a lot better than Penn does. It brings me back to Melissa's opening remarks, which we started out with a pretty decent budget, right? Which is now attenuated, right? And there have been some independent sources of funding, but that's sort of, this idea, there was a meme going around or a slogan going around in the early 2000s, the reason that women get paid less than men, we get more burdensome, women don't ask. We don't ask. And I'm like, who are you? I ask all the time. I get told no, right? I think I was at Matt Lane's office at least 20 times. I think the only reason he gave us space was to get me out of his hair. That might be true. I think it was. But, they'd like to say no because they think they can get away with it. And so one of the things, what do we do? How do we do that? Well, we have to keep fighting. We have to, keep up the good fight. But how do we do that, right? Anger is important, but it's also exhausting, right? Mm-hmm. It's exhausting. So how do we do that? Well, I think the flip side of that is vision. Our goals have changed over the past 50 years. They change, from director to director. They change from year to year, even. But our vision is always ambitious. It's always been grand. It's always been ambitious. One could joke that the reason it's so ambitious is because we get so little. But I'd like to say no. It's important because we understand the kind of world we want to live in, and we understand, as Phyllis said before, it's not just an intellectual enterprise, although it is centrally and vitally that. It is also a political. Our presence is very much a political statement to the university, to our colleagues, that yes, gender is important, sexuality is important, women count, as well as non-patriarchal men, and then non-binary persons, people that don't fall on that continuum. So even as we respond to changes in the field over time, we still have to hang on to keep on up our vision. And vision is what has led to things like the cluster hires, right? It has led to Jonathan's, big grant, right? These things vision does pay off, and it does sort of produce positive effects, including the 1/8 lines that Kathy got. Although I have to say, I'm a little annoyed that I'm the only one who's saying I'm also a professor of GSWS. One of the things I've said in a board meeting is the reason, the fact that they don't pay attention to us means you can get away with stuff. We're not allowed to call ourselves professors of gender, sexuality, and women's studies.
I just do anyway.
I do it. I know. So do I. Right. So do I. But we all have to do that. We all have to do that. That's just a small little thing in your email signature line. It's an easy thing to add. No one's going to pay attention. No one's going to notice. But it's going to create a statement. Oh, sorry. I'm having trouble with my eyes, and I have trouble with my handwriting anyhow. So, the new spaces, right? So a lot of those times you sit back and you think, oh, it doesn't feel like a lot. We still don't have this. We still don't have that. But it is a lot, right? And we have to keep reminding ourselves of that. I mean, it's hard. Well, anyhow, we have to keep reminding ourselves. I'll get to the point I was just going to make in a minute. That we have to make sure that we hang on to the vision and say, okay, this was part of the vision, and we've achieved that piece of the vision, and that's going to keep us, going, and maybe it'll give us some energy. But that brings to two or three major tools, which is, as Phyllis and others have said, collective action. And the other is, as Kathy has said, anger. Anger's a tool, right? It is exhausting, right? But it is also can be nourishing. Let's see, I think the best time I had with gender studies were 2 meetings with the deans where we had a group of us. And they tried to fire Dana and kill what was then the Alice Paul Center. Janice, I think, was acting chair at that time. About 10 of us met with Sam Creston. He was not happy, but we laid our position out. And when I started as director, I dragged about 8 or 9 other members into Steve's office. He was not happy. I don't think I'd ever seen his face turn red again. He was mad. We made our demands, and you have to keep doing that because, again, like maybe not everyone's like Matt Lane, but they want to get you out of their hair. But that collective action and that collective anger is really important. Now, the director, as we all know as directors, a lot of times you have to do that fighting yourself, right? That's part of the deal you take on when you become director, is you have to keep the fight up on behalf of your membership because they're doing their other administrative and teaching responsibilities, and this is the job you signed up for, and so you have to do that by yourself. And it feels exhausting. It feels like you're alone a lot. But we have to remember that we're never really alone. We are really part of a group that we can express this anger together. So anyhow, those are my thoughts about how we survive: vision, anger, and pissing people off.
Thank you, Dale. I just want to offer a little bit of context because this is my 5th job, and when I'm saying that I'm offering context, it's because I really want to talk about what it means to survive 50 years. It's my 5th job because every single time I set up queer studies programs, that's what I've done my entire academic career. And every single time I've done so, from institutions as varied as City College of San Francisco to Yale University, every single time a new dean has come and killed that program, right? So we have depended on the silence of strangers. And what it means to actually claim 50 years for me is an extraordinary thing. And as pissed off as I am about all the things we don't get, I want us to keep that in mind. So I'm going to talk a little bit about history. As an art historian, I lean heavily on both terms. We are beset by language, and the babble that surrounds us papers over the deep and defining incoherence of the terms and concepts that actually and materially structure our world. We know this at a deep level, as the proliferating language of our manifold differences testifies. But I want to take us back to the late 19th and early 20th century, Foucault's defining epoch, to show how definitional possibilities we've now lost and occasionally recovered were once at work. Karl-Heinz Ulrich's famous account of same-sex attraction as a form of gendered dimorphism of a male soul in a female body, or vice versa, held sway for much of the late 19th century, despite the advent, in 1869, of the term homosexual by the Hungarian writer Kerbeni. But by the early decades of the 20th century, the term homosexual itself began to gain traction. The issues that swirled in that primordial soup of nomenclature were, however, merely displaced in the transition from one term to another. While the earlier claim of gender dimorphism seemed to be overturned by the advent of a language describing same-sex love, in fact, the question of the biological sex of the subjects in that love was left vague. In fact, one of my central claims in a new global exhibition I'm preparing called The First Homosexuals, which will open May 1st, 2025 in Chicago, is that as language increasingly binarized the possibilities of eros into the polarity of homo-hetero, art picked up the slack, delineating a bewildering variety of sex-gender configurations for which we still lack a language. So I'm showing you here the Elisarian. And the Elisarian was founded in 1879 by a man by the name of Elisar von Kupfer, an Estonian who moved to, of all places, Minusio, Switzerland, and with his private fortune built a temple to a new religious practice that he called Clarism. And you are seeing the original temple on the left and the interior of it on the right, and you'll notice that it's been extremely decorated in paintings because he was, in fact, a trained artist. What's striking about this, first off, is that he chose Minusio, Switzerland, precisely because, to show you that nothing changes under the sun, in Minusio, in 1850s, there was a vegan nudist commune that was established. And he figured, in comparison, his investments in same-sex eroticism were relatively minor. But moreover, one of the things that is also so compelling about the Elisarian, can we see the next one? Oh,
You have it. There you go.
Is that Clarism held as its central tenet that the division of human beings into biological sexes was a violation of divine law. He advocated a homosexuality that he claimed was the true homosexuality, which is to say that everyone was of the same sex. And if you look carefully at his drawing, he is working out in a rather difficult medium representation, right, the illustration of that theological system. And continuously in every image in the Elisarian, he works to decenter any kind of gendered binary. In fact, he writes in his diary about how proud he is of his female hips and his nascent breasts. And so what I want to suggest is that if we're to take the term homosexual seriously, then we need to think about how the question of gender was always and everywhere present at its founding moment and is always implicated in its construction. Now, my computer is shut off, so hold on one second here. The dangers of technology. God, sorry. Why is it not opening?
It's if you're downloading it. Your system is downloading it.
Oh, God, it probably was. So let me be clear here that what I'm, and I should also just quickly show you a couple of other things. This is Edelmentia by a Russian artist. And I'm going to show you a number of images. One of the issues, one of the challenges in doing an exhibition of this nature was that there were a ton of images of adolescence, of Thebes in the period from the 1870s forward until about 1905. And initially, I had to hold the hands of museum directors and say, you know, it's not all going to look like this. But they were so concerned about what they claimed were the pederastic investments of these figures. And I'll show you another image so you see what we are talking about. But what I was successfully able to do was to turn the conversation from what seemed to be, right, the elevation of pedophilia into instead a real historical understanding of the terms under which sexuality got spoken. So, for example, in images of adolescence, what do we have but an example of the very gender dimorphism of Ulrichs, of male souls and female bodies and female souls and male bodies, because adolescence is the moment of incomplete engendering, right? And so you can see in paintings like this a kind of transitional moment from the Ulrichs model of sexual difference towards what would become quite strikingly visible just a few years later by one of the artists we just seen, right? He now does figures like this. Because as the term homosexual made, right, normative engendering its calling card, artists followed suit and produced works that, as you can see, were utterly normative in masculinity, trapping us in the world we live in today. Okay, now my computer went dead again. This is so annoying. I just moved and haven't yet plugged in my printer. Apologies. So, let me be clear that my goal is not a more accurate descriptive terminology for the sex-gender dyad. We stand as a field, I want to assert, for the deconstruction of the very terms of that dyad. But at the same time, as social and political activists, we readily deploy what could be misunderstood as an essentializing vocabulary of identity and representation. This is in part our problem. We are caught between the deconstructive potential of our theoretical work and the inherently and at the moment necessary deployment of a language of identity and community. We need money and institutional respect, of course, but we also need to solve a definitional crisis with roots at the very moment, not just of GSWS's founding, but of all of these issues that we are now negotiating. How do we articulate a vision of gender and sexuality with the kind of deconstructive skepticism it demands within the terms of activist engagement? Thank you. And if anybody's interested, I did another exhibition on exactly that theme, and here's the book. Oh, cool.
Hello. Hi, my friends. The last few days have been a little bit of a whirlwind of vibes for me. I've been inspired by former undergraduates who have forged their own paths by drawing on the concepts and methods that we teach. I thought the panel yesterday with undergraduates from our program talking about where they have gone was fascinating and so encouraging. It's something that I needed to hear as a teacher. I've been inspired by former graduate students who are also teaching those classes in their own universities and writing kick-ass books on vital and exciting topics. If I'm honest, I've occasionally been lost in the weeds of theories and frameworks that can feel overly abstract or niche if you're in an adjacent field. I will be even more blunt and say that I am frustrated that we have nearly 50 core faculty in this program, many of whom I haven't seen at this terrific symposium, although hopefully they've been online. But this is an event that has required so much labor, and it deserves a very full and active participation. I've been angered by reminders of how little the university has given us, despite how clearly GSWS and FQT are needed. And I have been deeply humbled by reminders of how hard people have worked to fight and how hard people have worked and fought to get what we do have. I thought I knew a lot of the stories that came through in that last panel, but I learned more, and it was I literally had goosebumps at moments. So I'm humbled and so grateful. So, what is an incoming director to do? I am. I need it. I'm gonna need it, y'all. So I'm very aware of adding yet another cis white body to the roster of people who've held this role, not entirely, but largely. And I'm aware that Penn is much more well-resourced than schools where feminist, queer, and trans activism is arguably more necessary than an Ivy League school where 20% of students are from the top 1 income bracket. I'm aware that I only have 3 years to make some sort of impact, which is one example of how a university protects itself from change. It keeps the groups of people who are most likely to agitate for feminist policies in places and roles that are fluctuating and under-resourced. But I'm also mindful of wisdom that I learned from participants I did in a project on union nurses. And they talked about their organizing work over also 50 years of generational change and advocating for themselves as women, largely in a field. And they said, you have to do what you can with what you have where you are now. So what can we do with what we have where we are now? Here's my plan. We have taught and we will continue to teach classes and advise students and support new generations of feminist thinkers and activists. We will model queer, feminist, and trans ethics of care in our classrooms at GSWS and the FQT. If we could just make the spaces that we hold feel as feminist and as safe as possible, that would be in this university, that would be such an achievement. We will continue to demand more money, more resources, more teaching lines, more space, and more time for ourselves and our communities. And when I say more time for ourselves, I mean we will do all of this while recognizing the limits that we have. We are not superheroes. We have caregiving obligations. We have obligations to our own bodies and our communities. We cannot expend ourselves so much. So that's part of what we are also going to demand. We will demand rest. And now more than ever, we need to document the damage of right-wing, racist, neoliberal, anti-feminist, anti-poor, anti-trans, anti-queer, anti-woman, anti-indigenous politics. We will also document forms of joy and thriving within communities that are currently under attack. We are going to ground our fight in rigorous scholarship, but also commit to scholarship that isn't just for each other, but also for a wider network of activists, advocates, and community members. And we are going to build coalitions. We will continue to seek allies across Penn and across Philly, but also elsewhere, being mindful of what others have said already. This fight is too big for one non-department. Allyship is a lofty goal, but it's really hard. A thing I have learned in my own activist life is the bar is too high if you think you have to like everyone that you work with. And if you think you can only work with people when you agree with them 100% of the time, this fight is too important. We have to set that aside. So allyship is hard, but it's necessary. And it also makes the parties after we win more fun. So I want you to know that I'm a retired riot girl and an English major in recovery. When I close by quoting Bertolt Brecht, in the dark times, will there also be singing? Yes, there will also be singing about the dark times. So Let us make a mixtape about the dark times and play it so loud that we have to be heard.
So, listening to this panel and the last panel, I'm again just humbled by how much sheer work and will has gone into this and will continue to go into this. Can everyone hear me? Okay. So I am going to just say a few words about the title of the panel or the problem registered by the panel, our political moment and what has been happening. And I want to do that by tracing how we got here a little bit. And by thinking about how what we're facing right now did not appear overnight, but has been the product of 50 years of very hard work. So our program and center are 50 years of hard work. The opposition to our program and center are the product of 50 years and more of very hard work from those who oppose us. One of the great successes of right-wing ideology is that it has persuaded so many in the academy and beyond that feminist, queer, and trans studies are at once trivial and terrifying. Though the buzzwords have changed, woke is the new PC, critical race studies the new multiculturalism, of which so many journalists and politicians are afraid now, or profess to be afraid. The playbook reaches back to the 1970s, when, in response to the foundations of Black studies, women's studies, ethnic studies, and other identity-based programs and departments, as well as expansions of the literary canon and changes in college and university populations, the right launched an offensive whose basic scaffolding persists in the present crusades against all that GSWS, FQT, and the Penn Women's Center stand for. The term culture wars would not enter the popular discourse until around 1992, when Pat Buchanan characterized that year's presidential election as part of, quote, a cultural war, as critical to the kind of nation we will one day be as was the Cold War itself. This view of the culture war as a vital political front was embraced by the right from the very early 70s on, when a cluster of reactionary donors, reactionary donors, evangelicals, and politicians formed dozens of new think tanks, training institutes, and super PACs, such as the Heritage Society, which shares the same birth year with GSWS, 1973, the National Journalism Center, and the Moral Majority, formed in 1977 and 1979, respectively. As Ellen Messer-Davidow, a political historian, recounts, these institutions would be joined by a dozen more right-wing organizations in the 1980s, including foundations, grassroots organizations, and legal centers, which together constituted, and this is Messer-Davidow, not merely a reticulated movement, but a massive apparatus consisting of several institutional systems variously articulated to create cultural change by manufacturing hysteria about what would come to be called political correctness. This new right apparatus was a reaction not to the campus radicalism it decried, but to the economic order established by the New Deal and the Great Society, along with the social changes begun by the civil rights, feminist, and gay rights movements. In other words, what the new right described as the politicization of campus work was, in fact, an opposition to the recognition that education had always been politicized. The new right went on the offensive by claiming to defend free speech, intellectual standard, and common sense, to rescue common sense, claiming to defend free speech, intellectual standard, and common sense from tenured radicals, corrupting young minds and thereby driving American civilization into the ground. In the early days of this offensive, NEH President William H. Bennett published reports entitled The Shattered Humanities from 1982 and To Reclaim a Legacy in 1984, both sounding the alarm that poor teaching and what Bennett called the proliferation of unrelated, mediocre, and uninspired curricular offerings had precipitated an unprecedented crisis in the humanities, evinced by plummeting majors. Bennett's successor, Lynn V. Cheney, published such, as president of the NEH, published such tracts as Telling the Truth and Tyrannical Machines, which proclaimed that the rise of feminism, Marxism, deconstruction, post-structuralism, and critical race studies were lowering standards, endangering free speech, and, quote, infusing doctrinaire politics into teaching. Because, Cheney wrote, ideas that are advanced, this is Cheney again, ideas that are advanced in colleges and universities often have an impact that reaches far beyond the campuses. The effects of this radical program have implications for all of the United States. Conservative columnist George Will explained this logic when he described Cheney as Secretary of Domestic Defense in what he called the low-visibility, high-intensity war against today's tenured radicals who have congregated in literature departments. These domestic enemies, Will went on, are more dangerous than the foreign adversaries her husband, that is Lynn's husband, Dick Cheney, must keep at bay, insofar as college professors are fighting against the conservation of the common culture that is this nation's social cement. By the early 1990s, the truism spawned and disseminated in the new rights think tanks, foundations, and training centers had gone mainstream. Right-wing journalists and cultural critics like George Will, William F. Buckley, along with books by Alan Bloom, Roger Kimball, and Dinesh D'Souza, sounded the alarm that feminist, gay and lesbian, Marxist, deconstructive, ethnic, and critical race studies constituted a coordinated and, quote, this is Kimball, ideologically motivated assault on the intellectual and moral substance of our culture, end quote. In their influential characterizations, these identity-based studies have become both laughable and lethal. These guys never tire of poking fun at recent MLA presentations with such titles as Eve Sedgwick's 1989 Jane Austen and the Masturbating Girl, and Judith Butler's 1990 The Lesbian Phallus, or Does Heterosexuality Exist?, repeatedly cited as examples of the assault on intellectual standards, common sense, and plain old-fashioned decency going on in academia. At the same time, what Kimball called the Sovietization of intellectual life was purportedly draining American college and university studies of beauty and freedom, just as the Berlin Wall was coming down. In the mid-1990s, Congress slashed the NEA and NEH budget on the same logic that Ronald Reagan had argued for cuts in public assistance. Like the welfare queens that the right demonized, feckless and freeloading academics were living large on the tax dollars of good, hardworking Americans. NEH funds for such institutes as the Summer Institute on Sex and Gender in the Middle Ages were described by Congressperson Steve Chabot, Republican of Ohio, as, quote, a handout to a couple of dozen college professors. This grant could be understood as a synecdoche for the profligacy of the NEH, which, Chabot argued, not only wastes tax dollars, but also, quote, breeds arrogance in the cultural bureaucrats who sneer at the citizens who pay their freight. In the decades since, arguments that the NEH fritters away money on frivolous research has expanded into a broader defunding of humanities departments in higher education on the grounds that they produce useless degrees. With this defunding of the NEH, universities have come to rely increasingly on the donations of politicians and state funding, who have also, with this, claimed more power over university and college curriculums. We see one outcome of this in fall of 2023. Some of you may have read about this in the news. Shad White, state auditor of Mississippi, filed a report arguing that universities should be incentivized to nudge students to high-value degrees in fields like business and contract management. White followed up with a tweet declaring, quote, that degrees in garbage fields taught by cheap professors who specialize in sexual identity or urban stand-up comedy are bad for the economy because they produce graduates who offer no real skills. By all means, White taunted potential humanities and gender studies majors, go take that Latinx environmental justice class in urban studies. Just don't ask taxpayers to pay for it. As in today's culture wars, much controversy centered on the elevation of Black women to positions of power and prestige. In the 1980s, right-wing cultural critics were losing their minds over the conferrals of the National Book Award, the Pulitzer Prize, and the American Book Award to Alice Walker, Gloria Naylor, and Toni Morrison. In 2023, the most visible instance of this was the forced resignation of Harvard President Claudine Gay at the behest of right-wing donors who claimed that she was a symptom of the DEI initiatives that were discriminating against, as Bill Ackman put it, straight, white, cisgendered men. Gay's resignation was trumpeted in the right-wing media as a blow to save academic standards from the woke mob. At the same time, the playbook of the 1970s and 80s was replicated in the congressional hearings that depicted campus protests against Israel's 2023-2024 attack on Gaza as evidence of rabid anti-Semitism. Led by Congresspersons Elise Stefanik and Virginia Foxx, the hearings began with Fox's statement that, quote, for years, universities have stoked the flame of an ideology which goes by many names: anti-racism, anti-colonialism, critical race theory, DEI, intersectionality, the list goes on, and that anti-Semitism, this is still Fox, anti-Semitism and hate are among the poison fruits of your institutional cultures, as Fox said to Gay, our soon-to-be resigned president Liz McGill, and Sally Kornbluth of MIT. I think that we should all be alarmed that Stefanik and Fox, among the most extreme opponents of reproductive autonomy, LGBTQ rights, and affirmative action, both of whom voted to overturn the results of the 2020 election, and both of whom had previously written on the need to defund DEI programs and programs in gender, sexuality, and critical race ethos, that these two persons leading the charge are supported by the same far-right political donors who pushed for Liz McGill's and Claudine Gay's resignation. At Penn, as the DP reported, shortly after McGill resigned, Mark Rowan and Ronald Lauder held a fundraiser for Virginia Foxx. As Jen Mannion reminded us last night, what gains have been made in the past 50 years are being eroded. The Heritage Foundation's Project 2025 is indeed a terrifying document, making their 1980 mandate for leadership, which shaped Reaganite policy for the next decade, sound positively tame. Pillar 3 of Project 2025 is the establishment of an online education system, a presidential academic administration academy to teach potential right-wing politicians and functionaries how to defeat the forces of quote-unquote wokeism. Along with Pillar 3, part of the Project 25 proposes that the FDA withdraw approval of abortion medication, that the CDC offer messaging against any contraception other than what we used to call the rhythm method, the gutting of the EPA and all other environmental regulations, the promoting of the U.S. as an explicitly Christian nation, the mass deportation of immigrants, the rescinding of DHHS regulations against LGBTQ discrimination, and the definition, as Mannion again reminded us, of the definition of the propaganda of transgender ideology as pornography, to be outlawed, with purveyors imprisoned and educators and librarians who teach transgender ideology classed as sex offenders. The last panel brought up a number of questions about voting and the need for voting in this next election. And I know for many people, as we saw in the recent issues, recent withdrawal of support for Biden in Michigan, a number of people are rightly disappointed by a number of Biden's initiatives. I want, though, to turn to something that Angela Davis said at a recent talk at Barnard when asked about voting in this next election. And I think that she put it very well when she said, and this is Angela Davis talking, she said, "I've never voted for someone in my entire career. What I voted for is who I would rather fight with and on what terrain I would rather struggle." And I think for the people who have been disillusioned with and disappointed with some of what the Biden administration has done, the question is, who would you rather fight with, him or Trump? On what terrain would you rather struggle, because you're going to be struggling on one or the other? I'll end by saying, though, that national elections do a lot, but there are also the day-to-day struggles here on campus, and solidarity for academic freedom, which is under unprecedented, I think, assault here at Penn, is equally necessary. We're facing really powerful people and really powerful, incredibly wealthy, incredibly well-funded machinery. And it's only through collective action that will be effective. So as Jessa said, we don't all have to agree on everything. We don't all have to like each other. But we all have to understand that we are fighting for the same thing and we are on the same team. And I hope that we'll remember that this year and in the years to come. We have a few minutes left for questions and comments. We started a little late, so we can go 5 minutes late. But yeah, I'll open this to comments. Liliana.
Thank you. I just want to point something out that wasn't quite mentioned, but maybe in my talking about the community, about family, community on family staff, community students was being based. The not we described in two ways. Either to be our teachers or to be hostile than it's another possibility. When I came to Penn, which was in the 90s, some people had suddenly realized that women have women power. It means there could be female donors as well. You have mentioned the remaining one. The lifetime and through studies was very long, but I'm trying to acknowledge this movie. And let me tell you, going into these offers with the leadership of Congress. Things that we want a lot of things. Unfortunately, I think they need to know about. The development office is a little bit like a thinking that makes they want to cut people very songs. And out of one is the others, I seem to be the good match for many people. Then funny for me because we all know women's studies is not of no smaller than this. But to meet people, you can make it high priority for the candidate to become. And didn't hear it is developing offers was a little bit like this. To me is very, very small and interesting of it. Salary is just lovely and would want to do manage please. You should she would stay in our pictures too, and then it's really will fine. Then, of course, was the problem. It looked fine. The detailed plan that describes what it did in line she the country, but this really was very the sun remarked that made a stumble. She slowly it was from her spirit. It was obviously the wealthy hardball one of the well family, and that was worth it now how did he use it. She cried, and then my husband he said this. Just knew that she did. So I don't want to always hope that was here for a movie. And the man was not declared that the husband was in the van and he was crying. It's really to be. What do I mean? See, it would be really useful to have meetings with me because we understand how it is moving. And for any act, they are some people out there with money as well. If we make out agree with everything they play, but yeah, if they don't support us, we have to compromise. But we also have to get them to be one. And that is the hard part. And that one can be step by step. And we need and then
We begged Alumni Relations for a list of women's studies alumni. They refused to give it to us. So if we could only find a way to find out who these people were, we would,
because in one doesn't need I'll go stay back. What the problem is to make sure that this is the priority to do something else.
That's the point, Lilian. It's not.
I want Jonathan too.
Yeah,
It's not. Jonathan has the most experience, but what I told Director, that's the first thing I did is I met with G. Marie. It was clear they were completely uninterested the first year. The second year, because I used some of the faculty members, like John Giulio, to put pressure, and I started talking to other people who were in development, then she started paying attention, but she was basically so that she could, and then Kathy did this. We've all done this.
Being study and you get rejected. I wasn't asked for being studies. I would do it for the university. That was.
Yeah, but you have to be invited in the first place.
You have to be let in the door.
Can I say so? People have alluded to this. We brought in a gift of $3.5 million for queer studies, and I thought that would open doors within the university's larger establishment. And what I was surprised to find is that Melissa and I did a program for some of the major donors to SAS, and afterwards they were very enthused following our presentation, asked to meet with us. I have followed up with development now 4 times, including in one instance having one of those people specifically say to me, please come visit, we need to talk about support. And we have not been authorized for that visit.
I think what we're seeing is what Gwendolyn was talking about. I mean, it is essentially the weaponization of bureaucracy. So yeah, we could go on, but if you have ideas of how to get names, we would love to hear them after this, because it is, it is like running up against a brick wall.
And Karis McGranger was business director and did something with us. She made pretty on project, a very, very rich woman who was the trustee. And instead of trying to get the developer company, she got that woman to insist they bring pressure on where she would get her money. So the development office now feel good at listening to us, but they're very good at listening to rich people who can give them money. So it didn't have anything in your social network or where.
That's the problem.
I don't know rich people. That's the.
I divorced my husband in a heartbeat. No, just
Yeah.
Carmen, go ahead.
He thought in her memo, which was Cafe Olay color. On board Cafe Olay color.
I need to meet friends like that.
Everyone in Israel is attached and would recognize something or is currently a staff being in all 21 lines when he's so. Have you never gotten involved in find out by dating some will hold in the story and I'm actually inspired. And that's what and story and charity that I do. That's where that race and work down the party culture and how is the world. But in quality, I actually connected with my role and discovered although Donald Trump, they're actually on class. Well, I haven't yet identified a member of the black I think not once. There. You can see how work that. So they give more white. I wasn't white some below for show. Guess what? They're nice people. And they've been helpful. I did something that I'm the history or combined with tour. Our constitution and they found the university of it. It's all with each knowledge for nothing knowledge and this out in the city. And I mean they connection with them. Like that really my entree like be wealthy. I think you can and she's still alive. I'm living the edge of that down, girls. That's all you can do those next. Well, you're not pretty associated.
Thank you.
I'm very going alone and keep out and it's full of social work. Names of the end of it. And I just really appreciate being here all 3 days. So I've been interdisciplinary study. So many of my classes we were brought with the plan and opponents and to honor equity and all of its work. And what I did from this section here is going straight to the stores. So we work all channels, but those straight to the source. Yes, maybe the process being gone to the office. But direct contact, you do it. So right now, you're doing a lot on volunteer had to do the work for the Philadelphia Public Safety. I'm on out doing both, but I finally just marched down to the school district office and go to the board meeting and meet with the superintendents and their staff and they were like, and they went, they're from good. And we all had phone and we have to utilize all of it and just continue to work together. And number one, where it first was, it's saying was, where are the students? You need more and more students. I'm so happy to start right here, but I hope that we can key at least part of this often when these right? They need to know about the department, and you know about the work, and you know it should be integral to the whole unit. How can you use it? The president's office, I'm sure a lot of it, there are a lot of curriculum, committees, and just getting the word out. But his power of the student goes along with it. Again, that's a Philly public school. When the kids go to the board meetings and testify, or years ago, did internet hall, they have to be different. Thank you all for Billy Waterfall.
Any final comments?
Just one.
Yeah.
The reason that all of this is coming ahead is because we actually have mostly one business. The white, they know that the demographics of this country have just terrorists. We are mostly now a brown country, mostly children in school, a lot of brown children. We have actually exactly an enormous amount of change, and the right has been slowly getting, struggling more and more to hold that. And it's not the misinformed folks in the pencil tucky, as we call it. It's the people who are pulling the strings. It's hard. Yes. There are people who have the most life. But they don't know how to the people. And we have been winning. Don't give up your agency, folks. And you said, go like the I am now like the year after I graduated because I went to the convention and I saw that and I needed to talk the fact and you that respect. Now I just work a lot. But anyway, agency all have agency that my Bruce have unity you have students. Activate every time you activate one very slightly voting. For one vote, and I get one other 50 vote and 2 votes, you very do that. That's 100% increasing.
I think that's a wonderful way to end. Thank you. And thank you all for being here today.
Right.